But it seemed pretty clear to us that you've got this quick take abilities, which actually could derive a major benefit. And it's really worth it for folks who are looking at municipalization across the country to see if their states have similar statutes that can be used in this way. Because you put your finger on it, that's the number one barrier is IOUs will drag it out. They have every incentive to do so, and they can spend almost unlimited sums in the courts. And none of us working at the municipal level have that same access to resources.
What if there were meaningful alternatives to the for-profit, investor-owned utilities that could serve us up a cleaner, more reliable, and more equitable electricity system? In a remarkable 400-page report called The Roadmap to Clean and Equitable Power in Michigan, a group of 20 students put together an analysis of 4 alternatives to the existing utility system structure, from a statewide public agency to a sustainable energy utility. Joining me in September 2024, Mike Schreiberg, Professor of Practice and Engagement at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, explained the 4 alternatives and what each one had to offer. I'm John Farrell, Director of the Energy Democracy Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and this is Local Energy Rules, a podcast about monopoly power, energy democracy, and how communities can take charge to transform the energy system. Mike, welcome to Local Energy Rules.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So I just want to start by asking you a question I like to ask all my guests, which is kind of like, what led you to this work as a professor and then to support your students in looking at this issue of electricity system governance and climate change?
Yeah, there's really 2 streams. One is my own interest, and I'm relatively new to being a professor. I've been at University of Michigan coming up on a year and a half now, but long in energy policy wonk, and most of my work has been in the nonprofit sector for various nonprofits, most recently National Wildlife Federation. And then as a local advocate, I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I've served on their energy commission for a decade, and I've done a lot of volunteering around those kinds of works. So that's one stream. But the second, and probably more important, is that we had 2 partners come to me and my colleague, Andy Buxbaum. And these partners were Michigan Climate Action Network and the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. And they really wanted to think long term and have, quote unquote, unbiased analysis. We know there's no such thing, but, like an analysis that takes an objective look to guide their work in the future. Is you only have so many chits in the nonprofit world and elsewhere and so much time. And they were thinking about what could be most effective if we're thinking about governance and energy governance in Michigan over the long term.
Well, I love how this came about. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit on how this report was developed, maybe starting with what were some of the initial questions that either those partners had or that you and the students had that you were looking to answer?
Yeah, so the initial questions were really, what if we envisioned a future either without or with a diminished role for investor-owned utilities? And it was sort of that big and broad. And this is in the wake of something I know you've covered well in the show, but some bruising energy battles here in Michigan over time and some local energy battles that have been going on. And the NGOs wanted to take a step back and look at big picture. And so we started what I would call a really iterative process here. We brought together top grad students from across different fields. So not only environment, public policy, and law, some of the places you might expect, but also business, physics, information systems, engineering, social work, public health, kind of you name it, we had it. And we had this incredible group of students apply to do this work. And they had to apply, we only could take 20 of them. And that brought them together for this iterative process. And then we started developing criteria, reliability, affordability, equity, and sustainability, and trying to figure out how we compare across different options.
Now, the summary of the report, I think, really does a really nice job of explaining its purpose. And I'll just read the quote from the report. Michigan's laws and policies are proving inadequate to solve our energy problems, given a spiraling climate crisis, increasing energy consumer demand, rapidly increasing costs, and decreasing grid reliability. Could you illustrate maybe with some numbers or examples, like what Michigan electricity customers are facing and why this is so important to address?
Yeah, well, maybe the basic example is I was out of power last week, and so were many of my friends and colleagues. Michigan has some of the highest costs, lowest reliability, and lowest environmental values of anywhere, certainly in the region and in the country. People are frankly fed up with the utilities. And there's been good work done at the legislative level as far as it goes. There's been good work done by our current governor and her team on that. But I don't think anyone would argue that we're moving fast enough right now compared to both the climate crisis, compared to the equity and justice challenges we have, and on reliability for sure. And so we're still not getting the best possible options for electricity. And that's no different than most places in the country. But what's happening is that communities like where I live in Ann Arbor are still stuck with this outdated grid, but want to do more. They want to do better. They actually want to get away from some of the dirtier fuel sources. And so these debates have been spiraling and heating up. And I know you've covered some of them here. It's not just in the little enclave where I live in Ann Arbor, but it's popping up in Detroit and sort of the metro areas. It's popping up in the rural communities here. And we kind of realized that the analysis of this wasn't keeping up with the demand for it. And so that's why we sort of brought this group together. And we paired the students, of course, we've got a lot of expertise, both here at the University of Michigan on faculty, but we also brought in experts from across the region, public service commissioners, all kinds of energy consultants, and people to kind of bring that knowledge base up really, really quickly. It was a learning process, and I don't mind saying a learning process for the faculty, myself and my colleague Andy as well, and really intense. Really intense. And, and the result, which I know is over 400 pages of analysis, among other things. It's a dense product, but that's because of the thought that went into it and the complexity of the issues that we're looking to address here.
Well, I appreciate you giving a nod to some of the things that we've already talked about on this podcast. I'll just, for people who want some specific things, episode 207, I had Gregory Woodring, who's the president and founder of Ann Arbor for Public Power, to speak about that local issue and discussion of electricity governance in Michigan. And then we also had on in episode 189, Alex Hill from We the People Michigan, talking about the issue of reliability, which obviously was something very recent for you and the disparity in the quality of the distribution system. So I've already been talking about some of those issues, or had people on to talk about some of those issues specifically in Michigan, giving a lot of really good context that I imagine also informed your report.
Yeah. And I'll say, John didn't tell me to say this ahead of time, but we use so many of these podcasts as our background too, an incredibly rich source of information. And frankly, there's not a lot of information out there in what I'd call the academic literature, in the peer-reviewed literature, that's looking really deeply at these sort of local energy options and these alternatives. They're both new, and there's not a lot of people studying them out there. So we were digging deep for information sources and using a lot of the conversations like we're having today.
So I want to start getting into the report here and hearing a little bit about what you discovered, what you were researching. The report offered 3 alternatives to today's grid model that is reliant primarily on for-profit investor-owned utilities that have a monopoly to serve a certain region of the grid. Then you also had one option that's focused on reform of that existing system. Could you just give like a high-level overview of the 4 options, and then we'll start to dive into them a little more?
Sure. And if we sort of array them in terms roughly of how radically different they would be from our current system, we'd start with analyzing what it would be like to have a statewide public utility. So this would get rid of investor-owned utilities and essentially have a co-op or a municipal model for the entire state and not have private companies. So that's probably the most extreme in terms of differences. The second would be something that probably people are very familiar with, but it's the expansion of municipalization. It's been very stagnant here in Michigan for reasons we can get into if we want, but what would it look like to have an expansion of that model? The next one, and probably the least known, would be the sustainable energy utility. Washington, D.C. and Delaware, places that have these functioning. But it's essentially, in the model that we were looking at, allowing a municipality to operate their own utility alongside an investor-owned utility without taking over the grid and the property. So it's sort of that middle ground on that. And finally, the option that people are probably maybe the most familiar with, a reform of what we call here the Public Service Commission. And, and every state's got their version of this, but separate out a little bit about what can be done now and what would require new legislation, and basically trying to take the best cases of how you tweak the current model on that. So if you array it from basically tossing out the current model completely and changing it to like how we can do tweaks to the current model, that's what we analyzed those 4 options. They don't neatly fall out on a grid, but that's roughly arrayed with how radically different they are from our current model.
It's probably worth noting that option 1, having a statewide public utility, was sort of what was on the ballot in Maine last year with the Our Power Maine campaign. And we did have someone on from that campaign to talk about how that turned out, which I won't spoil the surprise for people who haven't listened to that episode. But then we also have we did a 6-part series on public power called The Promise and Peril of Publicly Owned Power that kind of covers what you've talked in option two. And I'd love to talk more about those two public ownership alternatives. So, listeners, I'm sure listeners to this podcast are pretty familiar with the idea of city level public utilities. There's already over 2,000 of them in the US. So can you talk a little bit about, if I understand correctly, you were looking at this idea of sort of widespread city level utility takeovers, that option two for analysis?
Exactly. And what we did is we weighed the pros and cons, and there's debates raging here as there are elsewhere. And it's interesting because the general conclusion, and we kind of did this red light, yellow light, green light in terms of looking at across different criteria. But the general conclusion is that it can be beneficial to individual communities who have a good setup for municipalization. If they're set up right, if you have the right sort of politics behind it, if you have the right funding behind it. But there's, of course, no guarantee that you actually get the climate reliability and affordability benefits, right? You sort of get what the community demands and can get out of it. You probably have a better shot than you do with investor-owned utilities. But one thing that we looked at, which I don't think had been done before, is if you take this model and say there's more of them and say there's public support for building this, that part of the thing is there's a big initial cost to this. Well, what if you had pooled resources? What if you had state funds going towards it? It gets a little tricky on the equity criteria, right? Because it's probably good for the municipalities themselves, or it can be, just the profits from IOUs being transformed into community benefits. But it's probably bad in terms of rate structure for those outside the boundaries who are still stuck with investor-owned utilities, right? Because you're now taking away rate bases and all those other things. So we looked a lot at those justice implications, and it's a mixed story. And of course, they're all case dependent, but the municipalities are even more, I think, location dependent in terms of what kind of benefits you get out of it. So it wound up as kind of an option, I'd say, in the mid range with a lot of pros and cons. But when you start scaling it up, it does create this equity challenge. That's something that kind of jumped off the page to myself and the students working on this.
It's so interesting. I want to just dive into that for a second, because I think it's something a lot of people don't think about. But like, if the city of Ann Arbor, for example, went through with its public power campaign, exercised its right of eminent domain, takes over the infrastructure from DTE, what you're saying is somebody who lives a mile outside of Ann Arbor still is a DTE customer, and DTE is now maybe not as well off, for one thing, because they've lost the customers in Ann Arbor, but they're also not going to see any of the benefits of Ann Arbor's public power system. And is that partly to do with the laws around municipalization, right? That Ann Arbor can't extend its publicly owned utility to serve people outside the municipality?
That's correct. So the laws, and I honestly don't know how widespread this is. The laws in Michigan under our state constitution, our municipalities can only serve within their municipal boundaries. So, right, if you are, 100 feet or a mile or 10 miles outside, you can't be served by that municipality. And, a case like Ann Arbor, which is not unique in some ways, like in one bordering town, Ypsilanti is an underserved community that would be hard pressed to have higher rates. You've got a rural community in one direction, and you've got kind of a suburban community of Detroit that's relatively well off in another. Well, all those communities would be impacted quite differently when you take away a rate base of relative wealth and certainly of high demand, like Ann Arbor, because of the University of Michigan and some of the other things that are contained within it. And so a lot of it, of course, depends on how you set the boundaries of systems, right? That when you do this analysis, sort of an obvious conclusion, but it's something that we struggled with a lot, is how do you assess that? And we decided to assess, if you look statewide at municipalization, what would happen, and the justice and equity criteria start to not look as good at that moment.
You kind of alluded to this idea of, there's a big upfront cost for municipalization. It's something that drives me crazy when it gets brought up, because of course, when you're really buying, when you talk about a public power thing, is it's not like you're buying a bunch of infrastructure only, you're buying customers. You're essentially buying out the right to serve an exclusive set of customers. So the idea that it is expensive is both true and also a little bit misleading, because you're also buying the people who will pay the bills for that infrastructure. Now, I know there's a whole debate, of course, about what that price is that you'll pay. And that is something I've talked about on this podcast, that utilities try to jack up the price and make it less affordable for communities. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of potentially creating a pooled resource for municipalization efforts? And is there any way on the flip side, I'm thinking of Boulder, Colorado, where it's like they had the money as a community to pursue it, but they still spent a decade in basically like public referendums and litigation to try to do the takeover. Is there any way to like shorten that part of the process, or did that come up at all in the research?
Yeah, so it did, and one of the things that the law students and my fellow, I'm not an attorney, but my fellow faculty member who taught this with me, Andy Bucksbaum, is they found that there's actually quick take legislation here that municipalization campaigns can take advantage of, meaning the fair price for the muni gets determined up front, and you can start moving forward without these 10 to 20-year battles. And of course, folks like Greg, who you talked with Ann Arbor for Public Power, were really interested in this because you're still going to have court battles that rage probably for a long time because it's in the IOU's interest to drag this out as long as possible. But in the interim, that customer base is part of the municipality, and actually the assets have transferred over. And so I'm not sure exactly how many states have laws like this. This would be challenged in the courts and all that, but it seemed pretty clear to us that you've got this quick take abilities, which actually could drive a major benefit. And it's really worth it for folks who are looking at municipalization across the country to see if their states have similar statutes that can be used in this way. Because you put your finger on it, that's the number one barrier is IOUs will drag it out. They have every incentive to do so, and they can spend almost unlimited sums in the courts. And none of us working at the municipal level have that same access to resources. So there's a few kind of like, ace in your sleeve things like that this report brought out. This is probably the biggest of those.
If you have a link to the particular statute, I'd love to share it on the show page because I think people would be very curious about that. Although, of course, once I publish it, I feel like there'll be a raft of legislation being passed in various states, making sure that that isn't available. One of the things that we've seen is how the laws around municipalization, I think about the example in Minnesota specifically, and I cite this in a report I recently published, that after the investor-owned utility lost a case in front of the Supreme Court over a fight about municipalization, the state legislature just the very next year passed a law making it harder for cities to do public power takeovers. So it is kind of that connection between the political power of utilities. So I'd love to hear more about the quick take process, even if it's only available in Michigan at this point. I think people would be very curious to hear a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, and it might very well be available in other places. I just don't know. Our analysis was specific to Michigan, but I'd be glad to provide the links to that. And it was an exciting finding.
So I'm going to come back to, I mentioned very briefly about how Maine had a campaign on this sort of like most aggressive strategy of a statewide public power agency or cooperative agency. Could you talk a little bit more about like what that would look like? And are there any examples out there, either domestic or international, that we'd be able to borrow from?
Yeah, well, the short answer is no on the examples, at least in that domestically. I mean, Maine, we basically modeled what it would look like largely if Maine's efforts had gone through. Oh, sorry if I stepped on the punchline for that. But if it or
no worries,
if it had gone through, and I imagine most of your listeners have paid attention to the debate here. Nebraska is the only state where something like this exists. But I think the best way of thinking about it, at least when we were sort of analyzing this, it's like, how do we explain it? It's kind of like if a co-op covered the entire state. That's probably the best example of that. And then individual cities or municipalities could keep their municipal utilities, but you have a public authority that covers the entire state. We had to make a bunch of assumptions here, right? Because it doesn't exist. We brought in some utility economists to help us kind of look at the cost on this. We kind of leaned on our students who are in the business world, some of whom had significant consulting backgrounds to kind of do the assessment part of that and looked at the implications. But it really is out on a limb a bit because it's a developing model. And we tried to take what we thought were some of the best things of what was on the ballot in Maine, combine it with some of what's happened in Nebraska, and then use best practices for co-ops and kind of look at a model like that to form what we think would be the best statewide public power agency in Michigan if it existed.
That's great. Thank you for giving that overview. Well, I invite people to read more about it in the report and kind of like how that model would work. I know it makes me think of, I know there's been a campaign in New York to have like a statewide public power procurement agency that would focus particularly on electricity generation, which I think would be a little bit different from this. But it's kind of interesting to see how there are these different kind of overlapping ideas that folks have out there about how to exercise more public authority over this very important public service.
Yeah, and the basic premise of, and I know you cover this in many different ways, is that this is an essential public service. Why shouldn't it be something that's covered in the public way like other services throughout the state are? I mean, it's just a basic principle on that.
So I'm hoping we've kind of covered the two most ambitious options, the sort of statewide public option, the city by city public option. I was hoping you could explain the sustainable energy utility, in part because I still have a little trouble wrapping my head around it. But this idea that it's sort of the parallel city run utility to the incumbent utility. I just want to note that it scored the highest among the four models on the sort of like quick check metrics of climate, reliability, energy justice, and affordability. But it also, if I understand it correctly, kind of relies on people to opt into the services from that local sustainable energy utility. So I guess what kind of what examples did you have out there that gave the research team confidence it could perform so well, when history, I feel like, suggests that for a lot of these things involving energy choices, it's hard to get people to opt in to an alternative?
Yeah, I was a bit surprised by this overall because it's that it came out so well because it's the newest idea and probably the least tested in some ways. But obviously, the big advantage, and this kept coming up over and over again, is that you get to essentially shed the investor-owned utilities, but without the legal battles and the massive expense of taking over the assets. That in most of these assets here, like in many places, haven't been taken care of well, aren't necessarily useful for the modern energy economy. So when you start off with that base, and you can do it quickly, right? At least in Michigan, where this falls under the constitutional protection of municipalities. Municipalities can start this immediately. So here in Ann Arbor, it's actually on the ballot in November. So it's coming right up to actually form this. It's actually not even 100% clear that you'd have to put it on the ballot, but I think the political decision makers here decided, let's do it that way because then we are 100% secure, and politically, you know that it's going to be advantageous. But the disadvantage is, as you point out, that it's opt-in. And it takes a bunch of savvy, it takes a bunch of time from municipal staff or the staff of these sustainable energy utilities. So it remains to be seen how much opt-in that you get. Ann Arbor is making the argument that it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be more efficient, it's going to be more reliable, and you get your renewable energy with it. And so people are going to jump at this opportunity. But the scalability is difficult on this. And one of the things, too, is you cannot build alternative grids unless they're connected by people who opt in. So let's talk about like stringing together local solar, having a battery backup that say is shared by a block. There's a problem because you can't cross property boundaries unless people opt in. So there is difficulties in that piece. And so the pathway to do energy efficiency and home solar on there is pretty clear. I mean, you're just operating like an efficient energy service provider, essentially, but you're doing it with the advantages of municipal finance and things like that. When you start talking about community power, when you start talking about community solar, I think it's got high potential, but there are also really high barriers. And the other thing, of course, is that the IOUs are going to throw out every potential barrier to this because it is direct competition without having to pay for the asset value that they're trying to inflate, as we were talking about earlier. So there's a beauty to that, but the investor-owned utilities go after this option in any possible way they can. And we don't even know exactly how they would because it doesn't exist yet. But I guarantee that DTE is something that they are very, very concerned about.
I mean, I can imagine if, based on some of ILSR's research around the way that utilities exercise market power over interconnection, you're not buying those grid assets. And as you say, they might not be in very good shape, but they might also be really useful for that individual customer. Like, oh, I've got a solar project, right? Am I under the SEU going to set it up so it's like a standalone? Or am I, very often it's more advantageous to have it grid connected. Maybe there's compensation for excess generation, for example, that I can get that might be cheaper than a battery, or I can get that in addition to a battery. So, I can imagine a few things already that the utility might do. Yeah. And I guess, one follow-up question I did want to ask you about, in part because you had this sort of broader team beyond folks that just work on energy policy, is on this question of like crossing private property. I remember back when we did research on microgrids like a decade ago, and unfortunately things haven't changed much. The real barrier was on the multi-customer microgrid, right? It was, can you connect basically multiple electric customers, either going across public right of way like a street, even if it was like one city block and everybody opted in like neighbor to neighbor. I'm thinking about, okay, so you have the right to connect people. Maybe people are willing to opt into it, but how do you structure the legal framework for that? Like, would you do maybe you didn't even get into this, but I'm thinking already about like 99-year leases for, or like easements, that you do have for, like for someone who shares a driveway, right? Now you have that for like sharing an extra power line that's going down the alley. I don't know. It just blows my mind, this idea of how do you address that? And maybe that's what you were saying, is like that idea of multi-customer stuff is so complex, but there's lots the SEU could do for individuals.
Yeah, and it's exactly what, and we didn't get into that level of depth, but it's exactly what the city of Ann Arbor is working on now. And hopefully, if a ballot, and I'll just say personally, hopefully, if this ballot initiative passes, that's going to be the next step. And we've got a super innovative city leadership here. Missy Stoltz, who's our director of sustainability and climate action. I didn't get the title quite right, but at the city who's leading this, is looking into these very things and is starting to hire out some expertise to make that happen. The legal framework of being able to interconnect is there. Municipalities have that ability, constitutionally protected, and people can opt into it. But how you structure it's mind-bogglingly complex, and this would be groundbreaking. One of the things that I think that's happening, and I think it's happening in a really smart way, is starting with some very low-income neighborhoods that have had a lot of education on energy efficiency and renewables, and that are already operating in sort of a community-focused way. So there's one particular area of Ann Arbor where a lot of this action has been focused, and that both is a smart way to do it. It's also a just and equitable way to do it. And it's a way to build support within the community kind of from the ground up. And so that's one approach that's already underway here. But if the SEU, the Sustainable Energy Utility, gets off the ground, which I hope and expect it will, that'll accelerate. Because right now it's really just energy services on a one-on-one basis, as opposed to being able to do that as an entity and operating essentially as a utility, but without the shackles that come with the investor-owned utilities assets.
Yeah. One last question, and then I want to get to your broader topic on like the utility reform proposal. I was just, we were thinking back to the conversation about opt-out, opt-in, I thought about community choice energy or community choice aggregation, which I know one of Michigan's neighbors, Ohio, has had for quite a long time. This involves the city not taking over the grid, but getting to take over the procurement of electricity for its residents and small businesses. The reason I thought of it is, of course, because the successful versions of this really relied on an opt-out model. So when the city passed legislation to create this community choice provision, customers would by default be enrolled with the city and they could opt out rather than opt in. Is community choice something you looked at all in this report? Did you glean any sort of insights from the opt-out, opt-in concept that's part of that?
We didn't look at it because you can't do it right now in Michigan. It is banned. And as someone who grew up in Ohio, it's always painful for me to show that Ohio is ahead on these and some other things, actually, that we'll talk about in a minute. But we did not look deeply into that just because it would take a legislative change to allow that to happen.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, let's get to the utility reform option. I'm interested in this for a couple of reasons. One is because it's the one I'm most skeptical of coming into this conversation personally, but also just because I imagine that a lot of folks who are working in this space will gravitate toward it because of the like uphill battles to do a lot of the other ones. Obviously municipal takeovers, statewide public power, not an awesome track record of success over the past couple of decades. Super curious to see how the sustainable energy utility thing turns out, but I think a lot of folks have been focused on this idea of, can we reform the way the system works to make it work better? So can you just start by explaining what were the key four components of the utility regulation reform proposal that was part of your report and your investigation?
Yeah. So first, performance-based regulation. So this is, I think people are familiar with this generally, but it's linking utility revenues and rate making to performance, not just sales, and trying to do that well. The second is promoting innovation. So lowering barriers to change and barriers to innovation right now. And again, something that's been tried in different places. And the thought was, what if we put together some of the best models of this? The next is doing a percentage of income payment plan. So this is actually tying rates to income levels. Again, experimented on, and a couple of places are doing some of this quite well. What would the best models of this look like? And finally, having an Office of Consumer Advocate, so formally representing utility customers in proceedings under the aegis of the state. And so those are kind of the four components. And what we looked at are what have been some of the most effective components out there in our view so far. And I agree with you. I think many of these effective, I'd put that sort of in air quotes because sometimes it's work, but probably not to the level that many of us would hope. But what if you combine this together into sort of the most powerful force possible? How far can you get towards those goals of sustainability, reliability, affordability, and equity?
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I ask Mike to talk about the evidence behind performance-based regulation, why we should trust utilities with innovation, and how to implement income-indexed electric bills. You're listening to a Local Energy Rules podcast with Mike Schreiberg, Professor of Practice and Engagement at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. Hey, thanks for listening to Local Energy Rules. We're so glad you're here. If you like what you've heard, please help other folks find us by giving the show a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. 5 stars if you think we've earned it. As a bonus, I'll gladly read your review aloud on the show if it includes an energy-related joke or pun. Now, back to the program. So I'd love to dive into the performance-based regulation. Is there a decent record or evidence or examples of that working around these aims of climate progress, affordability, and equity in the U.S.?
There are, I would say, a few examples that may start working well, and Hawaii might be the best of those. Hawaii is been sort of working on this and has got its plan in place, and it's predicted to work by lowering costs and increasing sort of the environmental attributes of the grid. But there are also some concerning trends in that, so it's unclear how it's going to go, right? And that's the same in Connecticut. Connecticut's has been working towards this in some ways, but it's early on. And it's also unclear how it would go. So I wish I could give you a more definitive answer on that. I think the answer is we don't know. We don't know. And I'll just say I personally share some of the skepticism on this overall, but I also think it's important to look at this as in the short term and to take a clear-eyed look at what some of the states have been doing on this and, kind of see how they play out. But none of them are far enough along right now to know. I mean, the case in Michigan, it's like, I want to say this in a more neutral way, but we've been studying it since 2016, and I see no evidence that it's actually been put into place in any significant way besides really tweaking around the margins. And that's not what we're talking about here. If it's tweaking around the margins, it's not going to work or it's not going to hit those aims.
It's so funny you mentioned that because I remember there was a process. It had like a shorthand name. I think it was like E21 or G21, similarly in Minnesota. And it was going on for a number of years, broad stakeholder process. Utilities were in there, NGOs were in there, academics in there, businesses were in there. And they got to the point of kind of agreeing like, hey, we think there could be some really good outcomes from trying some more performance-based regulation. And it wasn't throwing everything out of the incumbent thing, but it was kind of like, how do we create incentives and penalties that might direct toward the outcomes that we want to see? And the next phase was, okay, we need to bring it to regulators or to the legislature in order to enact that change. And the utilities just dropped out of the process at that point. And we're like, well, nah, it was interesting to study it. Thanks for spending all that time, but we'd rather not change how this works because it works out very well for us. So I'm sure that one particular anecdote being from Minnesota and having watched that take place here has colored my perception of how effective we can be in getting it into place in other places. But I'm very curious to see how it turns out in both Hawaii and Connecticut for sure.
Yeah, and I think that experience is similar in that, the political power and sort of the market power utilities is huge. And actually, one thing I meant to mention up front, but I don't believe I did, is that we did not look at political feasibility of these options in the short term. We should have maybe framed that up front. And that's because our partners in this really wanted to look big. They wanted to look long term. And in the long term, anything's politically possible. So we didn't rate these on whether you could politically overpower the utilities or things like that. Michigan's got a structure where there's 2 utilities that control 90% of the market and are probably the most powerful forces in the state legislature. So you have a very strong incumbent utilities politically here. But we were looking at it based on sort of the policy wonk aims and against criteria, not against the politics. I wasn't saying you were giving difference, but it just reminded me that I forgot to mention that earlier.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, I'll come back to that particular question about political feasibility later. So I think it's good that we're teeing that up now. Let me talk about the second reform provision. So the first one was the performance-based regulation, and the second one was this idea about sort of an innovation sandbox. I guess one question I had about that was, why go through a process of creating an innovation sandbox, as it was called, for utilities who aren't just sometimes opposed to things that are different, but also have sort of a conservative culture of how they operate? And why look to do that as something that they would do, as opposed to like figuring out how existing companies that are doing innovative things like virtual power plants, maybe in states that have sort of more open tariffs or markets, figuring out some way to like bring that kind of innovation in?
Yeah, well, I want to, hopefully it's not either or, but this was a work within the system type of option. So whereas some of the earlier options were throughout the system and start fresh, this was kind of a look at what can we do within the current system. And when you talk about things like we were just talking about performance-based regulation, and we're going to talk about some things related to income and others, you actually have to provide some way for innovation. Otherwise, we're stuck in these same boxes. I mean, utilities have a incentive to be conservative. And that's not necessarily wrong. You don't want your electric utility taking unnecessary risk. But the structures that they're under right now do not allow for a lot of innovation, even within the rules. And then you go outside of that, and the IOUs have almost no incentive to go beyond that. So you have to set this up. And Connecticut, I think, has done a nice job with piloting this and sort of fast tracking changes and things like that. So I guess the bottom line is, it's not an either or, but within the structure that we have in the state, the virtual power plants, I would love to have options like that. They're not going to break through with the current legal and policy structure we have.
It's helpful to hear, though, that there is at least one place that is finding a way to allow the utilities to do that. And obviously, once you see something successful come through that too, it helps to start change that culture of like, well, we can try something, and it's okay for us to try something, and we're curious to do it, especially if it's tied into a way that they can earn money other than the traditional way. Let me ask you about the income index payment plan. So the third kind of component of utility reform. I'm sort of curious, like in terms of the mechanics, how that works as a customer. I suppose someone has to know my income for me to have an income indexed payment plan. How did your group envision finding that information or setting what somebody's bill would be like?
Yeah, so it has to be opt-in, unfortunately, for it. I say unfortunately just because a lot of low-income customers, based on experience, don't actually opt in to it. And so you can know there is some publicly available data that helps you target which customers may be eligible. But the only people who really know their own incomes and can verify it are the customers themselves. So that is the Achilles heel of this particular one. And I've worked actually more on this within the water sector, and that happens. It's the same problem. So you can target your marketing and sort of engagement around folks who are predicted to have these lower income levels. But because of confidentiality and other things, people actually have to prove, or they have to, show what their income levels are and opt into it. So that does limit the reach. And unfortunately, some other places have found that they've actually limited the number of people in the program so much that when people do try and opt in, it's been full. Obviously, that's an administrative problem. That's what's happened in some places like Ohio and elsewhere. But ultimately, people have to opt into it.
Did you look at all? I know, and maybe you didn't, which is fine, but I know one of the things that I've heard that was kind of intriguing, I don't know if it was around utility bills or maybe it was around community solar, but kind of some emerging conversations about partnerships with like the state agencies that manage either like family assistance dollars or food stamps, where it's sort of like, if you are already in that program, you're automatically enrolled in this program under the utility thing. Is that something that was possible, or is that something where you kind of, as you were alluding to, like confidentiality laws would get in the way?
We didn't look deeply into that particular thing, so I'm not sure. The bottom line is I'm not sure about that one. This is where it'd be helpful. The students who are doing all this detailed work, maybe they actually did, and I'm not recalling it at this moment too. So I don't want to speak fully on that, but I don't recall that. It's probably the better answer.
Yeah. Sounds good. Now I get to ask you to speculate a little bit, because I imagine this is not something you talked about so much in the report, but obviously something I think about a lot is in terms of the implementation of a utility reform scenario. There are a number of examples of utility regulators who are, to put it generously, very ineffective, from the Alabama utilities not being required to do rate cases for decades to Ohio regulators taking bribes from the utility companies they're supposed to oversee. So I guess I'm curious, like, to what degree do you see the success of the utility reforms relying on having utility regulators that are doing their job effectively and holding utilities accountable? To what degree is that an important component here in terms of the implementation? And is there anything else that we can do to make sure that that continues to be the case in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, it very much matters having regulators do their job. On that, and that's proven hard. And the examples that you just gave, Alabama and Ohio, are two of the extreme examples there. There's a couple of things that you can do, of course, to make it more likely they are. One is something that we were talking about, which is having an office of consumer advocate right in there. So within state government, internal accountability. Not been on the other end of this, like as I worked for a while at the Public Interest Research Group, and we were sort of ratepayer advocates and got some money from the utilities to come knock on the door and say, hey, are you considering what these rate impacts are to other people? But there's no substitute for having someone within state government. And then the other thing I'll give, and this is maybe a more general answer to this, is that having some of the right people, and I'll tell you something that gives me hope on this, and it's just a little microcosm from this group. I had this extraordinary group of really, really hardworking students on this that went above and beyond. There was at one point in this project where one of the students said, I could tell she was working hard on this. I said, how many hours are you putting into this class? Because, oh, for this class, 40 to 50 a week.
Wow.
And that was like for this particular class. And she was like, that's my last semester. This is what I decided to focus on. And I'm just doing it. And, this individual now actually works in the utility regulation space. And actually, 3 of these people from out of these 20 currently work either at NARUC or one of the utility commissions right now. And so that gives me great hope. We need incredibly motivated and smart minds like this that are that are in that regulator space. And the fact that these students actually were interested in that space and brought in, and that there are jobs available now. And that's where we're seeing infrastructure dollars and other things that are being sort of pumped into this. And so that gives me some hope on it. I don't want to be Pollyannish about it because it does depend on things that we've seen have failed, time and again. And the power of incumbent IOUs can never be underestimated. But I do see some glimmers of hope there.
I'm going to skip my last cynical question about utility political power because I think we all recognize that it is something that we have to contend with. And just ask you instead, do you imagine that the reform options that you've been exploring in Michigan could work in other states too?
For the most part, yes. When you look at sort of like the principle level and the basics of it, and if you look at the report, the chart that kind of compares these 4 broad options across the different criteria, those generally apply across the different states. Now there's nuances in each one, and the legal parts, like sustainable energy utilities work better in Michigan because municipalization is enshrined in the Constitution. It's not something that the investor-owned utilities can go after. And then there are parts within Michigan that make it harder to do that. One thing that I would say that's fairly basic and I think underutilized, and that our students turned up and some of the law professors that we're working with, is that states are probably not using the just and reasonable or the reasonable and prudent standards that are pretty much in every basic energy law and every statutory authority of public service commissions and others to the maximum extent. Now, some have started to push on that. In Minnesota, for example, started to use that more aggressively. Well, that's universal. You can actually get some of this done, we think, under existing authority without having to go back to the legislature. But each state, it also does depend what has to go back through the legislature and what are the politics of the moment for that and what are the politics of the investor-owned utilities. So, I'm going to give you the really precise answer of yes and no. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I don't know how I can do it much better than that.
I think that's very fair. Is there anything I didn't ask you about this report that you think is kind of an important finding or important lesson for folks who work in climate and clean energy advocacy or who work in the utility regulatory space?
No, I think the biggest thing is to think about the multiple criteria that we have for advancing energy reform or however we think about it, and how they can play against each other in a positive way. right? So one of the things we talked about is sustainable energy utility rose to the top because there are some strong justice criteria that can be part of it. And it depends on how it's set up at a local level, but because you have the option and because you're controlling some of the pricing and because you can provide direct services to customers, you can get those multiple benefits. And I think sometimes in this world, on advocacy and people focusing on a particular facet of the energy debate, we're not looking across the different criteria. And then what it means, the second thing I'd say, and we talked about this a little bit, but what it means outside the boundary of your own community. We talked about this with munis, because what if you're, 100 feet or a mile outside the boundary of the muni? What does that mean for the whole system? Because when we're talking about the wholesale changes that we need in our electricity delivery, we have to kind of lift up that level and look beyond the boundaries. So just sort of at the principal level, those are a couple of things that jumped out to me and what was an incredibly rewarding, intense process. And we're just in the stage of starting to distribute the results, and people have been really interested to see this work because it's a little different take on some of these questions that you and others are wrestling with and on a daily basis.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for joining me to talk about this report. For folks, again, a reminder, it's called Roadmap to Clean and Equitable Power in Michigan. I'll have a link to it on the show page. But a tip of the hat to you and your students for some incredible work investigating these really challenging questions of how do we get from where we are now to a future of climate justice and clean energy and the different pathways there.
Well, thanks. And thank you for having me. And I just want to, give the credit to the students who did this incredibly hard work. I spoke before about how that was, to me, maybe the best part of this, and what felt empowering and hopeful was all these incredibly bright young minds who were so focused on this, in some cases to the detriment of their own sleep and their other classes and things like that. They got so into it. And it just showed like the power of this and people searching for a new and better way. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Local Energy Rules with Mike Schreiberg, Professor of Practice and Engagement at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, where we discussed the Roadmap to Clean and Equitable Power in Michigan, a new report on alternatives to the monopoly investor-owned utility electricity system. On the show page, look for a link to the Roadmap report and to the quick take legislation we discussed related to municipalization. We'll also have links to the many related Local Energy Rules podcasts, including 2 with public power advocates, in Maine with Lucy Hochschartner in episode 197, and in Michigan with Gregory Woodring in episode 207, as well as our 6-part series on the promise and peril of publicly owned power. We'll also link to my discussion of disparities in Michigan's electric grid with Alex Hill in episode 189. Local Energy Rules is produced by myself and Ingrid Burson, with editing provided by audio engineer Drew Berschbach. Tune back into Local Energy Rules every 2 weeks to hear how we can take on concentrated power to transform the energy system. Until next time, keep your energy local, and thanks for listening.